For 2,000 years, humanity has stared into the face of a stranger. Every crucifix, every stained glass window, every Renaissance masterpiece has whispered the same lie, with such confidence that billions believed it without question. But somewhere, beneath the golden halos and flowing robes, beneath the pale skin and light brown hair painted by artists who never set foot in Judea, there is a face history forgot to preserve, the real face of the man who changed the world forever. Tonight, we go searching for it. There is something unsettling about realizing that the most recognized face on Earth may not be a face at all, but an invention, a composite of European imagination, imperial politics, and centuries of artistic drift, layered so thickly over the truth that the truth itself became unrecognizable. And yet the man behind that invention was real. He walked dusty roads under a Middle Eastern sun. He worked with his hands. He ate, slept, wept, and bled. Somewhere in that reality is an answer. Not a perfect photograph, because no such thing exists, but a picture built from evidence, from scripture, from archaeology, from the unforgiving facts of history itself. To understand what Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like, we have to first understand what he did not look like. He was not a tall, fair-skinned man with flowing chestnut hair and piercing blue eyes, gazing serenely toward heaven in soft candlelight. That image, so deeply embedded in Western consciousness, was not born in Bethlehem.
It was born centuries later, in the workshops of European painters who had never traveled east of Rome, who painted the faces they knew, the faces of their patrons, their neighbors, themselves. Jesus became, in their hands, a mirror, a reflection of whoever held the brush. But strip away the paint, strip away the stained glass and the gold leaf, go back past the Renaissance, past the Byzantine icons, past even the earliest Christian art, and travel to the one place where the truth was never hidden, only buried under layers of later imagination. 1st century Judea. Jesus was born into a Jewish family in the region of Galilee, in the town of Nazareth, a small, unremarkable settlement of farmers and laborers. This detail alone tells us something crucial. He was not a foreigner. He was not an outsider. He was, physically and culturally, a product of his environment, a Galilean Jew, shaped by the same sun, the same soil, and the same bloodlines as everyone around him. Scripture itself offers us a clue, though a surprising one. In the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before the birth of Christ, delivered a prophecy widely understood by Christian tradition to describe the coming Messiah. In it, he wrote something startling, that this figure would have no stately form or majesty to attract us, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Not strikingly handsome, not physically imposing, not a man whose beauty commanded attention.
If this description does indeed foreshadow Jesus, then the golden-haired, ethereally beautiful figure of Renaissance art is not just historically inaccurate, it may be theologically inaccurate as well. The Messiah, according to this ancient prophecy, was meant to be ordinary in appearance, approachable, unremarkable to the eye, yet unforgettable to the soul. This changes everything about how we should imagine him. Picture, instead, a man of average height for his time and region, likely somewhere between 5'1" and 5'5", based on skeletal remains recovered from 1st century burial sites across Judea and Galilee. Not the towering, statuesque figure so often depicted, but a man who would have blended into a crowd of his contemporaries. His skin would not have been pale. Under the relentless Middle Eastern sun, working outdoors as a carpenter's son, his skin would have been deeply tanned, a warm olive-brown complexion, weathered by wind and light, roughened by manual labor. His hair would not have been long, flowing, and light-colored. Jewish men of the era typically kept their hair at a practical length, and the dominant hair color among Middle Eastern populations of that time and place was black or dark brown, coarse, curly, or wavy, not the soft, straight locks of European portraiture. His eyes, too, would almost certainly have been dark, brown or nearly black, not the pale blue so often assigned to him by artists working thousands of miles and thousands of years removed from Judea.
His beard, consistent with Jewish custom of the period, would have been present. Jewish law and tradition of the time generally discouraged the shaving of facial hair, and a beard was seen as a marker of maturity and dignity. But it would not have been the long, carefully groomed beard of medieval icons. It would have been shorter, coarser, more practical, the beard of a working man, not a king. And his clothing, not flowing white robes untouched by dust, not elegant draped fabric in brilliant hues. Jesus would have worn the simple garments common to Galilean peasants and laborers, a tunic, likely made of wool or linen, undyed or dyed with the muted, inexpensive colors available to the working class, a cloak for warmth, sandals, simple and worn, suited for walking the rocky, dusty roads of Judea and Galilee, roads he would have walked for miles upon miles throughout his ministry. His hands, if we allow ourselves to imagine them, would not have been soft. He trained as a carpenter, a tekton, in the workshop of Joseph, a trade that demanded strength, calluses, and endurance. These would have been the hands of a laborer, not a monarch. This picture, dark-skinned by modern Western standards, dark-eyed, dark-haired, of modest height, dressed in the simple clothing of a working-class Jewish man, stands in stark contrast to nearly every image of Jesus that has dominated Western art and imagination for the better part of 2,000 years. And the question naturally arises, how did we drift so far from the truth?
The answer lies not in Scripture, but in politics, empire, and the slow, deliberate reshaping of religious imagery to serve the needs of those in power. In the earliest centuries after Christ's death and resurrection, Christian art was scarce and cautious. The faith was often persecuted, practiced in secret, in catacombs and hidden gatherings. When early images of Jesus did appear, they were symbolic rather than literal: a shepherd carrying a lamb, a fish, an anchor. There was little attempt to render his actual physical likeness, because there was no physical description to work from, and because the early Christian community was, for the most part, more concerned with his spiritual identity than his physical one. It was only as Christianity gained legitimacy and eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the 4th century that formal, standardized imagery of Jesus began to emerge. And here is where the transformation truly begins. As the faith spread northward and westward into Europe, as it became entangled with Roman and later European political power, the depiction of Jesus began to shift to reflect the people now claiming him as their spiritual center. Byzantine icons gave him a more Mediterranean appearance, with dark hair and solemn, elongated features. But as Christianity moved deeper into Western and Northern Europe, the face of Christ began to change again, lightening, softening, becoming more and more reflective of the European populations who now formed the heart of the Christian world.
By the time of the Renaissance, the transformation was nearly complete. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and countless others depicted Jesus with distinctly European features: fair skin, flowing hair in shades of brown or even blonde, eyes sometimes rendered in blue or gray. These were not historical portraits. They were theological and cultural statements, shaped by the world the artists lived in, the patrons who commissioned them, and the unconscious human tendency to imagine the divine in a familiar image. This is not a uniquely European failing. It is a deeply human one. Across cultures and centuries, sacred figures have often been depicted in the likeness of those doing the depicting. But in the case of Jesus, the consequences of this drift were profound, shaping the way billions of people would visualize the most influential figure in human history. So what evidence do we actually have, beyond inference and historical reasoning? Is there anything closer to physical evidence, anything that might bring us nearer to an actual image rather than an educated reconstruction? This is where the conversation grows more contested, more mysterious, and far more controversial. The most famous and most disputed physical artifact connected to the appearance of Jesus is the Shroud of Turin, a centuries-old length of linen cloth, bearing the faint, ghostly image of a man's body, front and back, marked with wounds consistent with crucifixion.
For centuries, believers have held this shroud to be the actual burial cloth of Christ, miraculously imprinted with his image at the moment of resurrection. If authentic, it would represent nothing less than a direct physical impression of the face and form of Jesus himself. The image on the shroud depicts a man of roughly average height for the ancient Near East, with long hair parted in the middle, a beard, and wounds strikingly consistent with the biblical account of the crucifixion. Pierced wrists, a wound in the side, marks consistent with a crown of thorns pressed into the scalp, and lacerations consistent with scourging. To many believers, this is nothing short of miraculous confirmation. But the shroud's authenticity remains one of the most fiercely debated questions in religious and scientific history. Radiocarbon dating conducted in the late 1980s placed the cloth's origin in the medieval period, centuries after the time of Christ, suggesting to many scientists that it could not be the actual burial shroud. Yet others have challenged those findings, pointing to possible contamination of the samples tested, and pointing to microscopic and chemical analyses that some researchers argue are more consistent with an ancient first-century origin than a medieval forgery. The debate has never been fully settled, and the shroud remains, to this day, an object of both devout faith and rigorous scientific scrutiny, a mystery wrapped in linen, refusing to yield its secrets completely to either side.
Whether or not the shroud is genuine, it offers something valuable regardless of its origin. A vision of Jesus far closer to the historical and archaeological reconstruction than to the Renaissance ideal. A Middle Eastern man, bearded, dark-haired, marked by suffering. There is something profound in this convergence between the archaeological evidence of what a first-century Galilean Jewish man would have looked like, the theological prophecy suggesting an unremarkable physical appearance, and even the contested image on the shroud. They all point in the same direction, away from the golden-haired, fair-skinned figure of Western art, and towards something far more human, far more grounded, far more real. And perhaps that is the deeper truth this question was always pointing toward. Perhaps the centuries-long distortion of Christ's physical appearance reveals something uncomfortable about human nature, our tendency to remake the sacred in our own image, to claim ownership over the divine by making it look like us. And perhaps rediscovering the true historical likeness of Jesus, a Middle Eastern, olive-skinned, dark-haired, dark-eyed working man, is not a diminishment of his significance, but a restoration of it, a reminder that the message of Christ was never meant to belong to one culture, one ethnicity, one artistic tradition. It was meant for all of humanity, and it emerged, historically, from a very specific place and people that deserve to be remembered accurately.
Consider what it means that the man history and archaeology point toward, short by modern standards, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, working class, without any physical grandeur to distinguish him, became, according to billions of believers across 2,000 years, the most consequential figure in human history. There is something staggering in that contrast. Not a king by appearance, not a warrior, not a figure of physical majesty who commanded attention by his presence alone. And yet his influence reshaped calendars, civilizations, art, law, morality, and the inner lives of countless generations. If the prophecy in Isaiah is understood correctly, if this truly was a man with no outward beauty to draw the eye, then the entire foundation of his impact rested not on how he looked, but on who he was, what he taught, and what believers hold he accomplished through his death and resurrection. The disconnect between his humble, unremarkable physical appearance and his immeasurable historical and spiritual impact may be in itself one of the most profound truths embedded in the Christian story. It forces a question that echoes across centuries, directed at anyone willing to sit with it. Would the message have mattered less if his followers had known, truly known, what he looked like from the beginning? Would the golden halos and porcelain skin of later art have ever taken hold if the earliest generations of believers had left behind an accurate physical description?
Or is there something almost fitting about the mystery,
that the face of Christ was never meant to be fixed in one image, one ethnicity, one artistic style, because his message was never meant to belong to one people alone. Historians, archaeologists, and theologians will likely continue debating the precise details of his appearance for as long as the question is asked. New archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding of what first-century Galilean Jewish men looked like, their height, their build, their clothing, their daily lives. The Shroud of Turin will likely remain a subject of investigation and controversy for generations to come, its threads holding secrets that modern science has not yet fully unlocked. And Scripture itself, ancient and layered with meaning, will continue to offer clues that scholars interpret and reinterpret across centuries. But what remains constant, what remains unshaken by any of this uncertainty, is the historical reality that a man did walk the dusty roads of Galilee and Judea 2,000 years ago. A man with dark skin weathered by the sun, dark eyes that had seen suffering and offered compassion in return, a short, coarse beard, simple clothing worn thin by travel, calloused hands built by years of manual labor, a man who, by every physical measure available to us, would have looked utterly unremarkable standing in a crowd of his contemporaries. And yet that ordinary appearance carried, according to the faith of billions, an extraordinary truth.
Perhaps that has always been the deeper lesson hidden within this question, that the divine does not require grandeur to be recognized, that transformation does not require a commanding physical presence, and that the most powerful figure in human history may have looked, to the untrained eye passing him on a dusty road in Nazareth, like nothing more than another humble face in the crowd. The search for the true face of Jesus is, in many ways, a search for something deeper than physical accuracy. It is a search for truth itself, a willingness to set aside centuries of comfortable, familiar imagery and confront a more honest, more historically grounded reality. It asks believers and skeptics alike to separate the man from the myth built around his image, and to consider that the true power of his story may never have rested in how he looked at all. Somewhere beneath 2,000 years of paint, gold leaf, and imagination, a face remains, not fully recoverable, not perfectly known, but reachable through evidence, prophecy, and reason. A face far removed from the one hanging in countless churches and homes across the Western world. A face that belonged to a specific place, a specific people, a specific moment in history, and yet came to belong, through faith, to all of humanity. And perhaps that is the final, haunting truth of this search. The real face of Jesus was never lost because it was forgotten. It was lost because it was replaced, deliberately, gradually, across centuries, with a reflection of whoever needed to see themselves in him.
Rediscovering it means letting go of that reflection and looking instead toward the dusty roads of ancient Galilee, toward a humble carpenter's son with sun-darkened skin and dark knowing eyes, who changed the course of human history, not through how he appeared, but through who he was.